Hey everyone, I am here with Marcus Lehto, the creative director and president of V1 Interactive. They are just about to put out Disintegration, and Marcus was generous enough to donate some of his time during a very busy period to sit down and talk with me about the game. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure to be here, Ben.
Before we get started, I think it's kind of important because Disintegration is sort of this unique, interesting thing where you're sort of blending genres. So to kind of get everybody on the same page, for those who may not be familiar with Disintegration, can you kind of tell me what it is in a general sense?
Yeah, so Disintegration is primarily a first-person shooter, but from the seat of a vehicle we call a grav cycle in the sky, blended with then tactical and strategic elements from an RTS, where you are commanding a set of ground units that you do from that pilot seat perspective, from that first-person perspective, in first-person mechanic kind of way. So it's all a real-time, fluid first-person shooter kind of experience with a nice, light, tactical RTS element over top of it.
Commanding these units and being able to heal them and worry about their health and have them all have their own special abilities that you can interact with during a mission while you are going and shooting and trying to avoid fire all yourself, definitely gives the game a very unique feel. And I guess I'm just personally curious, what was sort of the genesis of that idea? Like, how did that come to life, I guess? What was the initial pitch?
Well, it actually started out strictly as an RTS, where we were just flying the camera around, band selecting units, micromanaging them, moving them from one location to another, telling them to attack this set of enemies, and so on and so forth. And it was very straightforward. Felt cool, because we were really focusing on the simulation of combat as it played out on the battle space, and it was a really neat experience, but we knew it wasn't going to be something that really stood out from the crowd. So we flipped the tables, and we decided to say, all right, we're going to try something completely different. It was me and a set of, or two other programmers who were still college students at that time, who were contracting with me for a little bit while to build a prototype, to actually focus on trying something completely different, where we took that camera, turned it into a vehicle that flies around in the sky. We gave it onboard weapons for both offensive and defensive capability, and then made them an active participant in combat. So firing down on those ground units and having those ground units fire back at you, so you could be blown out of the sky. At the same time, then focusing on also commanding that set of ground units, and giving them contextual orders and using their smart abilities effectively and tactically in gameplay. It was one of these things that it started off real slow, and it started off in a way that was really complex, and it was overwhelming to the player, and we just kept boiling things down to where things were consumable to the player within minutes, to where it felt natural for the player to really fly and command the ship, engage in combat, but also at the same time manage those ground units in a way that just feels natural.
Yeah, that actually kind of leads into my next question, because for a first-person shooter, a lot of times the developers really try to make you the star of the show, where it's all about you and your own capabilities and how good you are at aiming and pulling the trigger and taking care of yourself. Whereas in RTS, it's much different. You have to kind of pay attention to an entire battlefield and not just like maybe the most immediate shootout. How do you find a balance there in a way that makes sense, where you're kind of catering to those maybe different impulses? I imagine it's pretty hard to find that point.
No, that did take a long time to figure out. And as a matter of fact, we like to describe it like this, where you and the grav cycle are your right hand. That's one part of the very important part of this equation. Your ground team is your left hand. It's kind of like the grenade that you might throw in a first-person shooter. Think of them like that. You use their abilities tactically in gameplay the same way you would use a grenade in a typical first-person shooter. So there's that kind of understanding you need to have with regards to the grav cycle. You, the player, as the grav cycle commander in the sky, and that ground unit. Those set of ground units that are yours to command. Like, you are one cohesive crew. You are one single entity. And so getting things wired up in a way that allowed us to treat those all of those parts together as one whole was the thing that took us the longest to get right. We went through so much iteration on making sure that the player felt connected to, and made sure that throughout the campaign, for instance, and even in multiplayer, you require that ground crew in order to be successful. If you don't use them properly, it's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back.
Not only are you, I think, trying to condition the player and make them comfortable with what you're trying to accomplish from a gameplay perspective, but you're also introducing this whole new world that players aren't familiar with a whole new cast of characters. And I guess how do you design the game in such a way where like both are kind of getting comfortable simultaneously?
Building a new franchise like this, or building a new IP in general, we're introducing the player to so much new content that we're asking them to absorb slowly over the course of the campaign. Not only are we asking them to learn a completely different kind of game than what they're used to playing, because there's really nothing else out there like it. So we rely on their intuition when it comes to hopping into multiplayer or into campaign, and kind of just taking their time to understand those core gameplay mechanics. But then, especially like in campaign, we introduce the player to new characters within the game, one step at a time. We introduce them to new grav cycle capabilities and new ground unit capabilities, one step at a time, with the goal of allowing them to kind of master those elements within the game one step at a time, to where they really feel empowered midway through the campaign and can really tackle incredibly serious challenges as they mount some of the more difficult missions at the end.
Just based on your former work at Bungie as a creative director and the artist behind Master Chief, I'm sure you definitely understand the importance of a main character that your entire game can kind of be wrapped around and really give it an identity. How, based on that experience, how did that kind of inform the cast of Disintegration?
Yeah, I thought about that for a long time, because one of our primary intents with the Halo franchise, of course, with the Spartans that we designed there, was that while some of them had voices, in general, the first-person character, the Master Chief, in addition to Noble Six in Halo Reach, were more empty vessels than anything else. They were there for the player themselves to embody and really make a story from their own perspective as they went through and played the campaign. In Disintegration, we wanted to make sure that all of the characters are flesh and blood, real character, that from the ground up, that they are interesting people that have back histories and have conflict with one another and have really interesting interplay between one another. That includes our main character, Romer Scholl, who you've probably seen in most of the images that have been portrayed of our game. That these characters are normal human beings. They're not genetically modified super soldiers. They're just normal people. And they're living under extraordinary circumstances with this willpower to survive and to really salvage what they can from the world around them. And ultimately, their goal, while they are in these robotic armatures themselves and have this unique capabilities about them, with regards to their strength and their power and their capabilities, Their real ultimate goal is to become human again, and that's the thing that bonds them all together, and it's really, I think, one of the key elements that makes the characters and the overall story of Disintegration so interesting to me when we were developing it.
Shifting back to the gameplay, I think when you play Disintegration and you are actually issuing orders to your individual units and kind of micromanaging them, the speed of the game makes a lot of sense, where typically in a first-person shooter, there's a lot of running and vaulting over objects and frantically trying to get behind cover, and you deliberately move slower in Disintegration, I think, to help you accomplish your tactical goals. But I've just seen some feedback on like YouTube videos and that sort of thing with Disintegration, where people are like, "Oh, it feels slow. It doesn't look exciting." Is that a perception that you think will be dispelled once people actually get their hands on it?
There was some feedback like that, you're right. And you said the word perfectly, that the design mechanics, the intent of the movement of the grav cycle was very deliberate. We don't want you to be too fast so as not to distance yourself from your ground crew. But that said, we had the multiplayer tech beta that came out earlier in the year, and we got a ton of great feedback from it. Some of it included the grav cycles feel too slow, or your ground units don't feel responsive enough. That was all great feedback that we took to heart, and we actually made changes to the game as a result. Opening up the FOV, speeding up grav cycles a little bit, increasing the agility and movement of the ground units so they're always there when you need them to be there. So those were the things that we worked on to make that first-person experience feel a little snappier, but still remain deliberate in its approach, because it is not a typical first-person shooter. That's one of the things I ask players when they hop into the game for initially, is to forget everything that you have as far as preconceptions as to what a first-person shooter should be, and really absorb yourself in Disintegration for what it is, and understand that the game is a different, deliberate experience, and that once you wrap your head around that grav cycle movement and your connection to that ground crew, things feel a lot more frenetic when it comes down to the split-second decision-making that happens not only in campaign, but also in multiplayer.
Absolutely. I feel like in the current age of video games, developers are not only taking into consideration sort of how players will perceive things at launch, but they have a roadmap for content 1 year down the line, or sometimes even farther than that. Is that something that you're thinking about with Disintegration? Like, we want to do this 6 months down the line, or 3 months down the line, or whatever it is, to keep people invested?
Yeah, we've already shifted focus over to post-launch support for the game. A large part of our studio is already working on new maps, new modes, new multiplayer crews, new skins, new banners, new badges, and emotes, all kinds of cool stuff like that. Of course, our goal then is to make sure that all the new modes, crews, and maps are all completely free to the public, because we do not want to fracture our community in any way, shape, or form. So that's real important for us, to just keep the ecosystem healthy and alive with all new awesome content. And of course, we're going to be listening to the community as one of the primary elements of feedback to allow us to pivot where needed. If the game needs to change one way or the other, or if certain crews are favored over others, that we can actually put a little bit more love into that part of the game where the community desires it.
Sure. I know, just interacting with our audience, that there's a segment of people out there that just have no interest in online multiplayer. So is additional single player missions a possibility down the line?
It is a possibility down the line, and that's one of the things we've been discussing as well, is how can we, as a very small studio of only 30 people, create additional content there that supports that side of our community. So it is something that we are absolutely discussing.
You mentioned it, and it's actually a good time, I think, to talk about it. With being such a small studio, I mean, you've had experience with completely different sizes of teams and budgets, and what, I guess, in comparison with your time at V1, I guess, what have you learned? What have been the benefits? What have been the challenges? Just kind of with this new venture?
Getting back to the roots of making games where it's a very small team has been one of the most rewarding parts of building V1, where even all the way through Bungie's history and making the Halo franchise, I was always hands-on with building content. I would never let that stuff go, because I just love making either characters or designing environments or helping drive the story or whatever it may be. That's just one of the things that I love about getting to make games in the first place. This is it's kind of like a hobby, so we love doing this. But getting back to that small team where everybody is hands-on and everybody is critical path to what we're doing and is just invested in what they're working on, because they are so they're like I said, they're so critical to some component of the game, whether it be animation, design, or engineering, some part that they own of the game that they've carved out. Like, that is so fantastic and important to a small studio. The hard part about that, of course, is that we have to wear lots of different hats. That we're not equipped then to handle every little teeny thing with a dedicated team like a large studio does. So it requires us to shift focus and wear a different hat several times during the day. But of course, that's part of the interesting part too, that makes it really fun for a lot of us. But it does, it requires us to be really focused and real in scope, especially for those of us who are used to making gigantic AAA titles with 300 to 400 plus people teams. It meant, just bringing scope in, making sure that whatever we're making is just a smaller form factor, but still high quality. We bring that high quality from that experience that we've gained over the many, many years of making big games. But we also have been able to hire brand new talent who is just young and eager and ready to make awesome games with us. And it's a pretty healthy mix overall at the studio. But it's also driven then with experience. And so we can kind of avoid some of the caveats that younger studios might often find themselves confronted with and unsure about how to proceed, whereas we have been through that several times and kind of understand how to avoid some of those pitfalls.
I can imagine, you mentioning sort of the younger members of the team that are less experienced, that passion is infectious and really energizing in a lot of ways. But does that different level of experience ever create, I guess, creative clashes that are hard to work through?
Not really. I mean, I think there's always personal and individual opinions about what might be better for part of the project. But as far as managing teams and far as making sure that we are all in this together and we're building this game together and we all have a voice, we make sure that we try to get everybody's opinion out there and heard and find the good things about, that's really great information that we weren't even thinking about, that we can include and modify and pivot a little bit here and there with one part of the project, or whether it's a design mechanic or the theme of a crew or whatever it may be. That kind of stuff is stuff that we want to make sure that everybody in the studio, doesn't matter who you are, has a voice and can voice that opinion and can be heard. Absolutely.
It sounds very much like a build each other up mentality, which I can imagine is super productive.
It's easier to do with a small team, that's for sure. It gets a lot harder once you get into the 80 to 100 person range, but we were only 12 to 20 people for a majority of the project, and it wasn't until just this last year that we're just around 30 now. And so as a small studio, we can just remain efficient and really keep our eyes on the ball. It's a lot easier for us to do that. And of course, we're not building our engine from scratch. We are using the Unreal Engine, so I don't have to hire a team of 40 engineers to build something from scratch. That comes with caveats as well, but it allows us to have a much smaller, intimate team.
I can imagine it's just on a personal level immensely rewarding with that size of team, making a game that has a full single player campaign, that has a multiplayer component, that you are going to be updating down the line. I mean, that's quite a task to take on with a small number of people.
Yeah, it wasn't initially going to be that big when we were getting started.
It always starts
we were
that
thinking,
way, yeah.
Yeah, we were thinking, okay, this would be a short 3-4 hour campaign, like seriously that short, and that we might have a little multiplayer component in there. But the more things grew, the more we got excited about it, and the more individual, like smart, talented people we were able to bring on board here at V1. Things continued to expand in really healthy ways. I mean, we were making sure that we were doing the right thing by expanding and continuing to grow the single-player campaign and all of the multiplayer components that come along with it then on the other side of things. So it's not without challenges for sure. Like there are times when we're scratching our heads thinking, I don't know how we're going to get this done, But because we are small, because we could remain efficient throughout the whole development cycle, that really was our ally along the entire way. And of course, it was really nice to have the support of our publisher on the other end of things, really making sure that they want a game that's as high a quality as possible as well. So there's a mutual admiration for what we really are going for together here for the end product.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. It was fascinating, not only learning the journey of the game, but getting insight into what the development was like as a small team. I guess to close it out, it would be best coming from you. When can we get our hands on Disintegration, and where will it be available?
Disintegration will be launching on June 16th. It'll be on the Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and Steam on PC platforms. So 3 platforms simultaneously from a small team in the midst of a quarantine.
I can't believe
I can't believe we actually got it all done on time, but it's going to be out there soon, and I cannot wait for the community to get their hands on it and start playing. I'll see you all online playing, and we can't wait for your feedback to see what you love about the game and where you'd love to see it continue to grow.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate it.
You never tire of that sound.